Hi everyone, I'm Midnight Truth, and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you are. Now, get comfortable to start. Story 1. It started with a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the walls. Sophia thought it was her imagination until she realized it was coming from inside her room. At 3:13 a.m., her phone buzzed with an unknown number. A single text message lit up her screen, "Don't look under the bed." She froze, the eerie silence now heavier than her pounding heartbeat. Who sent it? How did they know she was awake? And most importantly, why did they warn her? The night started like any other, with Sophia curled up in bed, scrolling through her phone until her eyelids grew heavy. She lived alone in an old Victorian house her parents had left her, a creaky, weathered structure that never seemed to settle. The place was full of strange noises, groaning pipes, floorboards that complained with every step, and the faint, eerie hum of the wind finding its way through the cracks. Sophia had grown used to these sounds. At least, she thought she had. Around midnight, she heard it for the first time. A faint tapping noise. It was so soft at first that she thought she imagined it. She paused her show and listened. Nothing. Shrugging it off, she continued watching. But a few minutes later, there it was again. Tap. 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 It wasn't coming from outside, and it wasn't the sound of a branch brushing against the window. This was closer. Inside. She turned off the TV and sat up, her heart thumping. "It's nothing," she muttered to herself, forcing a nervous laugh. The tapping stopped. Sophia lay back down, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself she wasn't spooked. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She tucked herself under the blanket, determined to sleep. Hours passed, and the house fell silent. She had almost convinced herself that the noise was just the house settling when, at exactly 3:13 a.m., her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It startled her out of a light sleep. Blinking groggily, she grabbed the phone. The message was from an unknown number. "Don't look under the bed." She stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the words. Her grogginess melted into confusion, then unease. Her first thought was that it had to be a prank. But who would send this? And at this hour? Sophia glanced toward the edge of her bed. The space underneath suddenly felt ominous, as though something was waiting for her to acknowledge it. She shook her head, forcing a nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous." She put the phone down and rolled onto her side, willing herself to ignore the weird message. Then, the phone buzzed again. Her stomach clenched as she reached for it. The new message read, "If you're reading this, it's too late." Her heart raced. She sat up, clutching the phone, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than before, almost alive. Sophia swallowed hard, her gaze drifting to the dark gap under the bed. She told herself it was stupid to even consider looking. But the words from the text crawled into her mind, refusing to leave. "Don't look under the bed." Her breath came in shallow bursts as she slowly leaned over the edge of the mattress. The darkness below seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing what little light the room had. She squinted, trying to make out shapes. Nothing. Just the dusty floorboards and an old box she hadn't touched in months. Relief washed over her. But as she sat back up, the tapping started again. It wasn't soft this time. It was sharp and deliberate, and it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the closet. Her phone buzzed again, and she jumped, nearly dropping it. Her hands trembled as she read the latest message. "You shouldn't have looked." A chill ran down her spine. She turned her head toward the closet door. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through the crack. The tapping turned into scratching, slow and deliberate, like claws dragging against wood. Sophia's entire body was frozen in place. Her mind screamed at her to stay in bed, to pull the covers over her head and wait for morning. But her body betrayed her. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. The lamp on her bedside table cast weak, flickering light as she approached the closet. The scratching stopped the moment she reached for the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, her breath caught in her throat. "It's just the house," she whispered, trying to steady herself. She pulled the door open. Nothing. Her clothes hung neatly on their hangers, the usual mess of shoes and boxes on the floor. She let out a shaky breath, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "See? Nothing." She turned back toward the bed, but then she heard it. A whisper. "Sophia." Her body went rigid. The voice was low, raspy, and so close it felt like it was right next to her ear. The lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Sophia grabbed her phone, its faint glow the only light left. Her hands shook as she opened the flashlight app. She shone the light around the room, but there was no one there. Her phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with another message. "Run." She didn't have time to think. The air grew cold, and she felt it, a presence behind her. A faint, icy breath brushed against the back of her neck. The tapping returned, but this time, it was on her shoulder. Sophia didn't move. She couldn't. The tap on her shoulder was light but unmistakable. She could feel it now, the icy presence behind her. Her chest tightened as her phone slipped from her trembling hands, the screen hitting the floor with a faint thud. The room was pitch black except for the weak beam from her phone's flashlight. Sophia forced herself to breathe, to think, but her body remained frozen. She counted silently in her head, 1, 2, 3. With every ounce of courage she could muster, she spun around. The cold air brushed past her, but the room was empty. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for something, anything, to explain what she felt. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the house was silent again. But then she heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps. They echoed from outside her bedroom door, moving down the hallway. Sophia's heart thudded against her ribs. She crouched down to grab her phone, gripping it tightly. She aimed the flashlight at the door, but it revealed nothing unusual. It was just her room, just her door. Yet the sound of the footsteps continued, fading into the distance. Her instincts screamed at her to stay in the room, to lock the door and wait until daylight. But something stronger, an almost magnetic pull, urged her to follow. "No," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "This is insane." She backed up to her bed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her breathing was uneven, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Who, or what, was in her house? Then, the footsteps stopped. She waited, listening, but all she could hear was the faint hum of her own pulse. Just as she was about to convince herself it was over, her phone buzzed in her hand. She flinched, nearly dropping it again. The screen displayed another message. "It's waiting for you in the hallway." Sophia's stomach twisted. She glanced at the door again, her grip tightening around her phone. She didn't want to open it, but the thought of staying in the room felt worse. Whatever was out there, it already knew where she was. Gathering her courage, she stepped toward the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling. She whispered a silent prayer and turned the knob. The hallway stretched out before her, dim and lifeless. The light bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows along the peeling wallpaper. She stepped out, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. "Hello." Her voice was barely audible, shaky and uncertain. She hated how small it sounded. No answer. She took a few cautious steps forward, the faint creak of the floorboards making her wince. The hallway felt wrong, too long, too dark, as if the house had stretched itself into something unfamiliar. Her phone buzzed again. The sudden vibration made her yelp, and she fumbled to read the new message. "Don't turn around." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She froze in place, her entire body stiff with fear. The words burned into her mind, and her instincts screamed at her to do the opposite. She wanted to turn around, to prove to herself that no one was there. But she didn't. Instead, she forced herself to keep walking. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the end shrouded in shadow. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was growing thicker. She reached the top of the staircase. Below her, the living room was barely visible, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Everything was still. Then, she heard it again, the footsteps. They came from behind her. Slow and deliberate, they moved closer. She could hear the faint creak of the floorboards, feel the weight of each step. Sophia gripped the banister, her knuckles white. She kept her eyes fixed on the staircase ahead, refusing to look back. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare check it. The footsteps stopped. The silence was unbearable, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She couldn't take it anymore. Against every warning in her mind, she turned around. The hallway was empty. Sophia let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling beneath her. She felt like she might collapse, her body exhausted from the constant tension. Then she noticed something. The door to her bedroom, the one she had left open, was now closed. Sophia's stomach churned. She stared at the door, her mind racing. How had it closed? Had someone, or something, gone inside? She turned back to the staircase, desperate to get to the front door, to get out of the house. But the moment she took a step down, she saw it. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs. It was tall and hunched, its features obscured by shadow. Its head tilted slightly as though it were watching her. Sophia's breath hitched. She stumbled back, her phone shaking in her hand. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move. Her phone buzzed again, the sound deafening in the suffocating silence. She forced herself to look at the screen, her vision blurring with tears. The message was simple. Don't let it reach you. The figure took a step forward. Sophia turned and ran. Sophia didn't move. She couldn't. The tap on her shoulder was light but unmistakable. She could feel it now, the icy presence behind her. Her chest tightened as her phone slipped from her trembling hands, the screen hitting the floor with a faint thud. The room was pitch black except for the weak beam from her phone's flashlight. Sophia forced herself to breathe, to think, but her body remained frozen. She counted silently in her head, 1, 2, 3. With every ounce of courage she could muster, she spun around. The cold air brushed past her, but the room was empty. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for something, anything, to explain what she felt. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the house was silent again. But then she heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps. They echoed from outside her bedroom door, moving down the hallway. Sophia's heart thudded against her ribs. She crouched down to grab her phone, gripping it tightly. She aimed the flashlight at the door, but it revealed nothing unusual. It was just her room, just her door. Yet the sound of the footsteps continued, fading into the distance. Her instincts screamed at her to stay in the room, to lock the door and wait until daylight. But something stronger, an almost magnetic pull, urged her to follow. No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. This is insane. She backed up to her bed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her breathing was uneven, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Who, or what, was in her house? Then, the footsteps stopped. She waited, listening, but all she could hear was the faint hum of her own pulse. Just as she was about to convince herself it was over, her phone buzzed in her hand. She flinched, nearly dropping it again. The screen displayed another message. It's waiting for you in the hallway. Sophia's stomach twisted. She glanced at the door again, her grip tightening around her phone. She didn't want to open it, but the thought of staying in the room felt worse. Whatever was out there, it already knew where she was. Gathering her courage, she stepped toward the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling. She whispered a silent prayer and turned the knob. The hallway stretched out before her, dim and lifeless. The light bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows along the peeling wallpaper. She stepped out, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. Hello. Her voice was barely audible, shaky and uncertain. She hated how small it sounded. No answer. She took a few cautious steps forward, the faint creak of the floorboards making her wince. The hallway felt wrong, too long, too dark, as if the house had stretched itself into something unfamiliar. Her phone buzzed again. The sudden vibration made her yelp, and she fumbled to read the new message. Don't turn around. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She froze in place, her entire body stiff with fear. The words burned into her mind, and her instincts screamed at her to do the opposite. She wanted to turn around, to prove to herself that no one was there. But she didn't. Instead, she forced herself to keep walking. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the end shrouded in shadow. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was growing thicker. She reached the top of the staircase. Below her, the living room was barely visible, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Everything was still. Then, she heard it again, the footsteps. They came from behind her. Slow and deliberate, they moved closer. She could hear the faint creak of the floorboards, feel the weight of each step. Sophia gripped the banister, her knuckles white. She kept her eyes fixed on the staircase ahead, refusing to look back. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare check it. The footsteps stopped. The silence was unbearable, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She couldn't take it anymore. Against every warning in her mind, she turned around. The hallway was empty. Sophia let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling beneath her. She felt like she might collapse, her body exhausted from the constant tension. Then she noticed something. The door to her bedroom, the one she had left open, was now closed. Sophia's stomach churned. She stared at the door, her mind racing. How had it closed? Had someone, or something, gone inside? She turned back to the staircase, desperate to get to the front door, to get out of the house. But the moment she took a step down, she saw it. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs. It was tall and hunched, its features obscured by shadow. Its head tilted slightly as though it were watching her. Sophia's breath hitched. She stumbled back, her phone shaking in her hand. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move. Her phone buzzed again, the sound deafening in the suffocating silence. She forced herself to look at the screen, her vision blurring with tears. The message was simple. Don't let it reach you. The figure took a step forward. Sophia turned and ran. Sophia ran down the impossibly long hallway, her bare feet pounding against the floorboards. The sound of her breathing filled her ears, ragged and panicked, as she clutched her phone like a lifeline. Behind her, the faint, deliberate footsteps grew louder. Whatever it wasn't rushing, it was following. She didn't dare look back. Her heart raced as she reached the end of the hallway, only to find something that shouldn't have been there. A door. It was new, completely out of place in her familiar home. The door was tall, painted a deep crimson that seemed to glisten, almost as if it were wet. There was no handle, only a keyhole at the center. Sophia stopped, skidding to a halt, her mind racing. This door had never been here before. It wasn't part of her house. She turned to look back, but the hallway was now empty. The figure was gone. For a brief moment, Sophia felt relief. But the feeling was short-lived as her phone buzzed again. The message read, "The key is in your room." She stared at the words, her hands trembling. The idea of going back to her room, back to where this nightmare started, filled her with dread. But what choice did she have? Sophia glanced back at the red door. It loomed silently, waiting. She didn't want to think about what might happen if she stayed here too long. Gathering her courage, she turned and walked back down the hallway. Each step felt heavier, as though the air itself were fighting her. When she reached her bedroom door, it creaked open on its own. The room was pitch black. Her lamp was still off, and the flashlight on her phone seemed dimmer now, barely cutting through the shadows. She scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. The closet door was open again, its interior darker than she remembered. Sophia stepped inside, her breathing shallow. She whispered to herself, "Where's the key?" The phone buzzed again. Under the bed. Her stomach twisted. Of course it was. She knelt down, the floor cold beneath her knees. Her hand shook as she aimed the flashlight at the gap beneath the bed. The beam illuminated the dusty floorboards, the forgotten box she had seen earlier, and something new, a small, rusted key. Sophia hesitated. Her instinct screamed at her to leave it there, to run. But the presence in the hallway, the red door, left her no choice. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the key. As soon as she grabbed it, a sound erupted from the closet. It was a low growl, guttural and inhuman. Sophia scrambled back, clutching the key. Her phone slipped from her hand, the flashlight beam spinning wildly around the room. She grabbed it just in time to see something move in the shadows. A figure stepped out of the closet. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, smooth like porcelain. The creature tilted its head, as if studying her. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She backed up against the wall, her mind screaming for her to do something, anything. Then the creature spoke. Not with words, but with a sound like nails on glass. It scratched at her mind, filling her head with a deafening static. Her phone buzzed again. She tore her gaze away from the creature long enough to glance at the screen. Run back to the door. She didn't need to be told twice. Sophia bolted out of the room, the creature's distorted limbs scraping against the floor as it gave chase. She ran faster than she thought possible, her feet barely touching the ground as she reached the crimson door. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She fumbled with the key, her hands shaking as she tried to fit it into the keyhole. Finally, it clicked. She turned the key, throwing the door open and stepping through without looking back. The door slammed shut behind her. Sophia stumbled forward, collapsing to her knees. She was no longer in her house. The air was thick and humid, and the light around her was dim and unnatural, like twilight stretched too thin. She stood, her legs weak beneath her. All around her were walls made of dark, pulsating stone. The ground beneath her feet felt alive, shifting slightly with every step. Her phone buzzed one last time. "Welcome." The word on her phone, "welcome," sent a chill through Sophia that rooted her to the spot. She stared at the screen, hoping for another message, anything to explain where she was. But the phone fell silent, the faint glow of the screen barely cutting through the dim, eerie light surrounding her. Her eyes darted around. The walls weren't made of stone as she had first thought, they were flesh-like, glistening and pulsing faintly, as if alive. A wet, rhythmic sound echoed faintly, like a heartbeat coming from deep within the structure. The air smelled metallic, sharp, and nauseating. Sophia gripped the phone tighter, her only source of light in this alien place. She turned back to the crimson door she had just come through, but it was gone. In its place was another fleshy wall, indistinguishable from the others. Her breathing quickened. She spun in a slow circle, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, curving slightly so she couldn't see far ahead. No doors, no windows, just this grotesque, living maze. The phone buzzed again. Her heart leapt as she looked down at the screen. Another message. "Keep moving. It's already awake." Sophia's knees buckled. She had no idea what it was, but she didn't want to find out. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was causing it was aware of her now. With no clear direction, she chose the path to her right and started running. The floor squelched under her feet, soft and warm, sending shivers up her spine with every step. The walls seemed to shift as she moved, subtly altering their shapes and angles. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the creature from her closet to appear again, but the corridor behind her remained empty. Her phone buzzed again. She slowed to a stop, dreading what she'd see this time. "Don't stop running." A sound erupted behind her, a deep, guttural growl that shook the very air. Sophia's heart jumped into her throat. She didn't hesitate, she sprinted forward, her legs burning as she pushed herself faster. The growl turned into a roar, and the thumping rhythm intensified, echoing through the corridor. It wasn't just behind her anymore, it was all around her, above and below, as though the maze itself was alive and angry. The path ahead split into two. She skidded to a halt, gasping for air, and looked desperately down both tunnels. They were identical. Her phone buzzed again. Left. She didn't think twice. Sophia turned left and kept running, the roar behind her growing louder. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing at times until she had to duck, then widening into cavernous spaces where the walls stretched so high she couldn't see the top. And then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just on the edge of hearing. But they grew louder as she ran, overlapping and chaotic, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "Help me, run, don't stop, it's watching." Sophia clamped her hands over her ears, trying to drown them out, but the whispers were inside her head. She stumbled, nearly falling as she turned a corner. The whispers faded just as abruptly as they had started, replaced by a deafening silence. The corridor ended. Sophia skidded to a stop, nearly colliding with the wall in front of her. She turned, her chest heaving, but the path behind her was gone, replaced by a solid wall. "No, no, no," she cried, slamming her fists against the fleshy surface. It was warm and unyielding, pulsing faintly beneath her touch. Her phone buzzed again. "Wait." Sophia stared at the screen, her pulse racing. Wait? For what? The thought made her sick. The walls around her began to shift, their pulsations growing faster, more violent. She backed up until her shoulders hit the corner of the dead end. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against her chest like a weight. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the wall ahead, peeling itself from the living flesh. It was massive, its limbs long and distorted, with jagged protrusions where fingers should have been. Its head was too large, tilting unnaturally as it stepped closer. Sophia froze, her legs refusing to move. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, its eyeless face turning toward her. Her phone buzzed again, and she forced herself to look. The message read, "Don't blink." Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the creature, her eyes burning from the effort of keeping them open. The creature tilted its head, studying her, then stepped back into the wall, melting into the pulsating surface like it had never been there. Sophia collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The walls around her began to shift again, pulling apart to reveal another corridor. She didn't wait for another message, she forced herself to stand and started walking, her legs trembling beneath her. The new path was narrower, the air even heavier than before. She glanced at her phone, hoping for some kind of direction, but the screen was blank. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. "It's not over, keep going, it knows where you are." She kept walking, her heart pounding in her ears. The whispers were joined by faint laughter, high-pitched and childlike. It came from all around her, echoing off the fleshy walls. And then she saw it, a door at the end of the corridor. It was smaller than the crimson door, painted a sickly green that seemed to pulse in time with the walls. A faint light seeped through the edges, casting strange, flickering shadows. Her phone buzzed one last time. "You have no choice." Chapter 5, The Green Door's Bargain. Sophia stood frozen, staring at the sickly green door. The light seeping through its edges seemed alive, flickering and twisting in unnatural patterns. The whispers had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that only made her heart pound louder in her ears. The phone in her hand buzzed again. She hesitated before glancing at it. The message was simple. "Open it, or it opens you." Her stomach churned at the cryptic threat. She had no idea what lay beyond that door, but the idea of staying in this pulsing corridor, surrounded by walls that seemed to breathe, was even worse. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The closer she got, the more the air around the door felt charged, like static electricity crawling over her skin. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch it. The surface was slick and warm, making her pull back instinctively. "No choice," she whispered to herself. She pushed the door open. The world beyond the door was disorienting. The light from inside was blinding at first, forcing her to shield her eyes. When her vision adjusted, she found herself standing in what could only be described as a paradox. The room was both infinite and confined, its walls shifting constantly between stone, flesh, and a shimmering void. Strange symbols pulsed on the ground beneath her feet, glowing faintly with an unrecognizable energy. And at the center of the room stood a figure. It was cloaked in darkness, its form indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming. It didn't move, but Sophia felt its attention snap to her the moment she entered. The air around her grew heavy, as though the space itself disapproved of her presence. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her trance. The message read, "Speak." The figure tilted its head as if waiting. Sophia's voice cracked as she asked, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it raised one skeletal hand and pointed to her phone. The device buzzed in her hand, messages flooding the screen so fast she could barely read them. A choice. A trade. You will listen. You will obey. Sophia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand." The figure stepped closer, and she felt the temperature in the room drop. Its presence was suffocating, and every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was slower, deliberate. "A bargain must be struck. Your life for another." "What does that mean?" she whispered. The figure's voice filled the room, low and resonant, vibrating deep within her chest. It wasn't a sound but an experience, a feeling of something ancient and immense. "You were chosen." Sophia's knees buckled under the weight of the words. "Chosen for what? I didn't ask for this." The figure extended its hand, and the room around her began to shift again. The walls flickered with images of people, strangers, family, friends, all frozen in moments of their lives. She saw her parents sitting in their living room, her best friend laughing at a party, a neighbor she barely knew watering his plants. The images stopped abruptly on one face, a woman she didn't recognize. "Her," the figure said, its voice cutting through her thoughts like a blade. "What about her?" Sophia asked, her voice shaking. "Her life for yours," it replied. "The maze demands balance. You must choose." Sophia stumbled backward, her mind reeling. "I can't. I don't even know her." The figure didn't move, but its presence grew heavier, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. "If you do not choose," it said, "the maze will choose for you." Sophia's phone buzzed again, and a new message appeared. "Decide now." She stared at the woman's face on the wall. She looked ordinary, smiling in a way that suggested she had no idea her life was being bargained away in this horrible place. Sophia's hands shook as she lowered the phone. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. She couldn't condemn a stranger to save herself, but the alternative was unthinkable. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but the walls began to shift again. The woman's image dissolved, replaced by a reflection of Sophia herself. Her reflection screamed. The sound was inhuman, a tortured, guttural wail that filled the room and echoed endlessly. Sophia clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Stop," she cried. The figure lowered its hand, and the screaming ceased. "Choose," it repeated. Sophia fell to her knees, the weight of the decision crushing her. She didn't want to die, but how could she live with the knowledge that someone else had paid the price for her survival? Her phone buzzed one final time. The message read, "You have 5 seconds." The room began to darken, the walls closing in around her. The figure loomed closer, its form growing larger and more menacing. Sophia gripped the phone, her mind a whirlwind of panic and despair. I choose." The words caught in her throat as the ground beneath her began to split open. The light from the symbols on the floor flared, blinding her, and the last thing she heard was the figure's voice, cold and final. Too late. The blinding light from the splitting ground swallowed Sophia whole. She screamed, reaching out for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing but emptiness. Her body felt weightless, suspended in the void, as if she were falling endlessly. The light burned her eyes, but when she closed them, the whispers returned, louder, angrier. You failed. Weak. Unworthy. She wanted to scream back, to fight, but her voice was gone. The sensation of falling stopped abruptly, replaced by cold, hard ground beneath her. Sophia opened her eyes cautiously. She was back in the maze. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, its fleshy walls pulsing with a sickly glow. The air was colder now, and the heartbeat-like thumping was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. She pushed herself up, trembling, and glanced around. The green door, the figure, the strange room, all gone. Her phone buzzed. She didn't want to look but knew she had to. The message read, "You've lost more than time." She didn't understand, but dread clawed at her insides. As she stood, she noticed the walls of the maze had changed. They weren't just pulsing, they were moving, writhing like they were alive and agitated. Then she heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, echoing from somewhere behind her. But they grew louder, faster, accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing. Sophia's heart raced as she spun around, searching for the source. The corridor was empty. Her phone buzzed again. Run. Sophia didn't hesitate. She bolted down the corridor, her legs burning with each step. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer, until they sounded like they were just inches away. She dared a glance over her shoulder and froze. A figure was chasing her, but it wasn't the creature from before. This figure looked human, its face familiar in a way that sent a chill down her spine. It was her. The figure's face was a twisted, screaming reflection of her own, its eyes hollow and dark. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. It clawed at the walls as it ran, leaving deep gouges in the pulsing flesh. Sophia turned back and ran harder, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone," she screamed, but the thing didn't stop. Its distorted voice echoed through the corridor. "Choose, choose. Choose." She turned a corner sharply, hoping to lose it, but the maze shifted around her. The walls ahead twisted and contorted, blocking her path and forcing her to double back. The creature was closer now, its ragged breaths echoing in her ears. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to stop, but she needed answers. Face it, or lose yourself. She stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. The creature skidded to a stop a few feet away, its grotesque form twitching as it stared at her with those hollow eyes. "What do you want from me?" she cried. The creature tilted its head, its face twisting into a mockery of a smile. "Everything," it hissed. Sophia's hands shook as she raised the phone like a shield, as if the messages could protect her. The creature lunged, and she screamed, raising her arms to block it. But it didn't attack. Instead, it stopped inches from her face, its cold breath brushing against her skin. "You didn't choose," it whispered, its voice fractured and echoing. "Now you're mine." Sophia stumbled back, her heart pounding. "No. I didn't know what to do. The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "The maze doesn't forgive. It takes. And now, It's taking you. Before she could react, the creature lunged again, this time slamming into her with inhuman force. The world around her blurred and shifted as she was thrown against the wall. But the wall wasn't solid. She fell through it, tumbling into a new space. The room she landed in was different from anything she'd seen before. It was vast and empty, the floor made of cracked, black stone that seemed to stretch forever. Above her, the sky, or what passed for it, was a swirling vortex of shadow and light, churning like a storm. In the center of the room was a mirror. Sophia hesitated, her body aching from the fall. The mirror seemed ordinary at first glance, but as she approached, she realized it didn't reflect her. Instead, it showed images, moments from her life. She saw herself as a child, laughing with her parents. She saw her first day of school, her graduation, her happiest memories. But the images began to change, showing her darkest moments, the fights, the betrayals, the mistakes she wished she could forget. Her phone buzzed again. The message read, "Do you see now? The maze feeds on you. Your choices, your fears, your guilt. Everything you are." "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't fair." The mirror darkened, and a new image appeared. It was her, trapped in the maze, running endlessly, screaming for help that would never come. The creature's voice echoed around her. "You are part of it now. A fragment of the maze, like all the others who failed." "No," she screamed, pounding on the mirror. "This isn't real. It can't be real." The vortex above her began to descend, its shadows reaching out like tendrils. They wrapped around her, pulling her toward the mirror. She struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter they held her. Her phone buzzed one last time. "Goodbye, Sophia." The shadows pulled her into the mirror, and everything went black. Sophia's body was weightless, suspended in a sea of darkness. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the void. There was nothing but silence. She felt like she was falling again, but it wasn't the fall that frightened her, it was the knowing, the realization that whatever happened next, she would never escape. The shadows that had engulfed her were no longer there. She couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. Her body felt disconnected, as though it had become part of the darkness itself. Then, a light appeared. It flickered like a dying candle at first, then grew steadily brighter until it filled the space entirely. But it wasn't warm. It was harsh, cold, and blinding. The light twisted into shapes, distorted and jagged, like something trying to break free. Sophia blinked, struggling to focus. She felt as though she were being pulled toward it. The ground beneath her reappeared, though it wasn't solid, more like shifting sand, soft and uneven. Suddenly, she was standing again. She gasped, her chest tight with panic. The maze had shifted once more. The walls were gone, replaced by a vast, empty expanse. The floor was covered with broken glass, pieces of shattered mirrors reflecting her fractured image in every direction. Sophia stumbled forward, her legs unsteady. There was a feeling in the air now, a sense of finality. She knew, deep down, that whatever was coming next was the end, of her journey, of her torment. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the space, its silhouette dark against the harsh light. The figure was familiar, too familiar. It was her, or rather, a twisted version of herself. The reflection of the figure in the glass was wrong, though. It wasn't a mirror image. It was warped, her own face twisted into something grotesque, her eyes darkened, her mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too sinister. The twisted version of herself stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest as she took a step back. What is this? Sophia's voice cracked, barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It only smiled, its eyes hollow, empty. The light around them dimmed slightly, casting long shadows that stretched across the room. Sophia could feel the temperature drop, the cold biting at her skin. She couldn't breathe, her lungs heavy with the weight of the moment. "Why are you doing this?" she begged. The twisted version of herself raised a hand, and the space around them seemed to shift. The glass beneath Sophia's feet cracked, sending shards flying in every direction. She cried out in pain as some of the shards grazed her skin, drawing blood. The twisted figure didn't flinch. "You wanted to escape," it said, its voice echoing in the emptiness. "But you didn't understand the price." Sophia's chest tightened. "What price?" The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it stepped closer. With each step, the world around them seemed to distort further. The light, the glass, everything was pulling toward the figure, as though it were the center of this nightmare. "You thought you could choose," it continued, its voice cold and cruel. "But the maze chooses for you. Always." Sophia shook her head, her mind racing. "No. I didn't understand. I didn't know. I didn't know what I was choosing." The figure's smile widened. "That's the thing. You never do." Sophia stumbled back again, her legs weak, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The world around her was falling apart. The glass cracked further, the shards sinking into the ground, creating a web of broken pieces beneath her. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The world froze. The figure remained motionless, its twisted smile locked in place. The shards of glass hung in mid-air, suspended like an illusion. There was no movement, no sound, just the cold, oppressive stillness. Sophia felt something shift inside her, a pull, a realization. She understood now. She wasn't just in the maze anymore. The maze was in her. The broken glass around her began to reflect not just her twisted self, but everything she had ever done, every mistake, every choice she had made in her life. It was all there, glaring at her, forcing her to face every moment she had tried to forget. She saw the people she had hurt, the chances she had wasted, the lies she had told herself. The whispers were gone, replaced by an unbearable silence that seemed to scream in her mind. The maze hadn't been about survival. It had been about accountability. Sophia fell to her knees, her chest heaving. The twisted figure remained motionless, as if waiting for her to accept the truth. I'm sorry," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. The figure spoke again, its voice soft, almost sympathetic. "It's too late for apologies, Sophia." Suddenly, the room began to close in. The walls, once distant and unyielding, now moved toward her, pressing in from every side. The light flickered again, dimming, until everything around her turned to darkness once more. Sophia tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt herself sinking into the ground, her body giving in to the weight of her guilt, her mistakes, her fear. The last thing she heard, as the darkness swallowed her whole, was the figure's final words. "Welcome to the maze. You'll never leave." Story 2. The town of Ravenwood was known for two things, its quiet charm and its secrets. Hidden away from the bustling cities, it was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The streets were lined with old Victorian-style houses, their windows darkened by thick curtains that suggested no one wanted to be disturbed. Even the air felt heavy, as though the town itself was holding its breath. For Liam, working as the night janitor at the Ravenwood courthouse was supposed to be an easy gig. The building was old, sure, and carried its fair share of ghost stories. But Liam wasn't one to believe in tall tales. He liked the quiet. He liked the paycheck. Most of all, he liked the fact that no one ever bothered him. But tonight, as he walked through the courthouse doors, he felt an unusual tension in the air. It wasn't something he could see or hear, just a nagging sensation, like a faint hum in the back of his mind. The courthouse was a massive structure, its walls lined with portraits of long-dead judges and town officials. Their stern faces seemed to watch him as he walked past, their eyes following him down the dimly lit hallways. Liam had always found the portraits creepy, but tonight they seemed almost alive. He shook off the thought and got to work, starting with the main courtroom. The large wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, revealing the familiar rows of benches and the imposing judge's bench at the front. Liam flicked on the lights, which buzzed faintly before casting a pale, yellow glow over the room. As he began cleaning, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. He froze, his mop mid-swipe. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small in the vast, empty space. No response. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It pressed down on him, making the air feel thick and suffocating. He told himself it was just his imagination. The building was old, it creaked and groaned all the time. But as he resumed cleaning, the feeling of being watched crept over him. It was subtle at first, like a tickle at the back of his neck. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Liam chuckled nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "Get a grip, man," he muttered to himself. An hour passed without incident. Liam had nearly convinced himself that everything was normal. He moved on to the upstairs offices, mopping floors and emptying trash cans. The second floor always gave him the creeps. It was darker, quieter, and filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. But he kept his head down, focusing on his work. As he finished cleaning one of the offices, he heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were louder, closer. He stepped out into the hallway, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice echoing. Still no answer. But this time, the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, faster, as though someone, or something, was running straight toward him. Liam's heart pounded as he backed into the office, slamming the door shut behind him. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. He stood there, his back pressed against the door, trying to catch his breath. For a moment, he considered calling the police. But what would he say? That he heard footsteps in an empty building? They'd think he was crazy. Gathering his courage, Liam opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. It was empty, as though nothing had happened. But as he turned to head downstairs, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light, stood a figure. It was barely visible, its body blending into the shadows. But Liam could see its outline, a tall, motionless shape standing completely still. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. Liam took a hesitant step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm calling the police," he shouted, though he wasn't sure if it was a threat or a plea. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though studying him. Then, without a sound, it raised an arm and pointed toward the staircase behind him. Liam's stomach churned. He turned to look at the staircase, half expecting to see something there. But it was empty. When he turned back, the figure was gone. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing. This wasn't his imagination. Someone, or something, was in the building with him. Desperate for answers, he pulled out his phone and opened the camera app, aiming it down the hallway. He didn't see anything unusual, but when he reviewed the photo, his heart stopped. The image showed the same hallway, but in the shadows where the figure had stood, there was now a face. Pale and expressionless, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight at him. Liam dropped the phone, his hands trembling. He needed to get out. Rushing downstairs, he headed for the main doors, only to find them locked. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely hold them. Finally, he managed to unlock the door and step outside into the cool night air. But as he turned to look back at the courthouse, he saw something that made him question his sanity. In every window, on every floor, stood the same figure. Watching him. And then, as if on cue, all the lights in the building went out. Liam ran. The next morning, Liam woke up in his small apartment with a pounding headache. He didn't remember falling asleep. In fact, the last thing he remembered was running as far away from the courthouse as his legs would carry him. The events of the night before felt like a fever dream, hazy and unreal. But when he glanced at his phone on the bedside table, the photo was still there, the hallway, the shadow, and that face. His stomach churned as he stared at the image. He thought about deleting it, erasing any trace of what had happened, but something stopped him. It felt important, like proof that he hadn't imagined it. Liam took a deep breath and tried to focus. It was just some prank, he said aloud, as if hearing the words would make them true. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. By noon, he decided to go back to the courthouse. He told himself it was just to pick up his belongings, his jacket, his tools. But deep down, he knew he needed answers. The courthouse looked different in the daylight. Less menacing, almost ordinary. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Liam felt a little braver as he pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The air was still, but not as heavy as the night before. He moved through the building cautiously, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. When he reached the main courtroom, he stopped in his tracks. The chairs were back in their proper place. For a moment, Liam felt a wave of relief. Maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe he was just overtired, and his mind had played tricks on him. But as he stepped closer to the judge's bench, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the wood of the bench, deep and jagged, was a single word. Why? Liam stumbled backward, his heart racing. He hadn't imagined it. Something, or someone, had been here. He turned and hurried out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As he made his way upstairs to retrieve his jacket, he passed the portraits again. But this time, something was different. The faces in the portraits were no longer looking straight ahead. They were turned, their eyes following him as he moved. Liam stopped in front of one of the paintings, his breath catching in his throat. The judge in the portrait, a stern-looking man with a bushy mustache, seemed to be staring directly at him. No, Liam whispered, shaking his head. It's not possible. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the glass covering the painting. It was cool and solid, just as it should be. But when he stepped back, the judge's expression had changed. The stern look was gone, replaced by a cold, cruel smile. Liam stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. His jacket could wait. He needed to get out of here. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were slow and deliberate, coming from the staircase at the end of the hallway. Liam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He turned to look, and what he saw made his blood run cold. At the top of the staircase stood a figure. It was the same as before, tall, shadowy, and featureless. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, standing in a line on the stairs, were more figures. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, staring at him with their hollow, unseen eyes. Liam's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move. He bolted down the hallway, his shoes pounding against the wooden floor. As he ran, the building seemed to change around him. The hallways grew longer, twisting and turning in ways they never had before. Doors that were supposed to lead to offices opened into empty voids, their darkness swallowing the light. Liam's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to find his way out. But no matter where he turned, the footsteps followed. When he finally reached the main doors, he stopped short. Standing in front of the exit was the first figure, its hand raised, pointing directly at him. Liam backed away, his mind racing. He was trapped. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. And then, in that same whispering voice, it spoke again. Why? Liam's vision blurred as panic took over. He turned and ran toward the nearest window, throwing his weight against it. The glass shattered, and he tumbled out onto the lawn outside. For a moment, he just lay there, gasping for air. The sunlight felt warm on his skin, a stark contrast to the icy terror he'd just experienced. When he finally looked back at the courthouse, the figures were gone. But the whisper still echoed in his ears. For the next few days, Liam stayed away from the courthouse. He avoided the building entirely, calling in sick to work. He couldn't bring himself to talk about what had happened, not to his co-workers, not to anyone. But the courthouse wasn't done with him. It started with the dreams. Every night, Liam found himself back in that courtroom, standing in the center of the room as the shadowy figures gathered around him. They never moved, never spoke, but their presence was suffocating. In the dreams, he couldn't escape. No matter how hard he ran, the hallways stretched endlessly, trapping him in a maze of darkness. When he woke up, drenched in sweat, the whisper would echo in his mind. Why? By the third night, Liam had had enough. He needed answers. He needed to know what was happening to him, and why. He started researching the courthouse, digging through old newspapers and town records. What he found only deepened the mystery. The courthouse had a dark history, one that the townspeople rarely talked about. Decades ago, it had been the site of a high-profile trial, a man named Edward Carlyle, accused of murdering his wife and 2 children. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, but Carlyle maintained his innocence until the end. His final words before his execution were chilling: "This place will never forget." Neither will I. Liam couldn't shake the feeling that Carlyle's words were connected to what he had experienced. But why would the courthouse target him? He had no connection to the trial, no reason to be drawn into its dark history. Desperate for help, Liam reached out to an old friend, Sarah. She was a journalist who had spent years investigating strange phenomena for a local paper. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was her. When Sarah arrived at Liam's apartment, he wasted no time explaining everything, what he had seen, what he had heard, and what he had found in his research. Sarah listened carefully, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. When he showed her the photo on his phone, she frowned. "This isn't normal," she said finally. "But it's not unheard of." "What do you mean?" Liam asked. "There are places in this world," Sarah began, "that hold on to things. Pain, anger, fear, they leave marks. And sometimes, those marks linger." "You're saying the courthouse is haunted," Liam said flatly. "I'm saying it's more than that," Sarah replied. "This isn't just a ghost story. Something about that place is alive. It's feeding off of something, or someone." Liam felt a chill run down his spine. Feeding off what? Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a small recorder and pressed play. The sound that came from the device was faint at first, a low hum that gradually grew louder. It was a recording from inside the courthouse, taken years ago by another journalist investigating the Carlisle trial. As the hum grew louder, voices began to emerge, whispers, overlapping and chaotic, as though a crowd of unseen people were speaking all at once. And then, clear as day, Liam heard it. "Why?" He stared at Sarah, his blood running cold. "Where did you get this?" "It was sent to me anonymously," she said. "I never published it. Too many questions, not enough answers. But now, I think I know why it came to me." Liam didn't like the way she said that. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, then pulled out a folder filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings. She spread them out on the table, pointing to one of the photos. It was an image of the courtroom, taken during the Carlisle trial. At first, Liam didn't see anything unusual. But then his eyes landed on one of the faces in the crowd. It was him. Liam's heart stopped. This has to be a mistake," he stammered. "That's not possible." Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Liam, how much do you know about your family history?" "What does that have to do with anything?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Everything," Sarah said quietly. She pointed to another photo, this one of Edward Carlisle. Liam stared at the image, his mind racing. The man in the photo looked eerily familiar. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes. "No," Liam said, shaking his head. "No, this doesn't make any sense." "Liam," Sarah said gently, "I think you're connected to this place in ways you don't understand." Before Liam could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, his hands trembling. The screen showed an incoming call, from an unknown number. Hesitating, he answered. "Hello." For a moment, there was silence. And then, in that same whispering voice, he heard it again. "Why?" Liam dropped the phone, his heart pounding. When he looked at the screen, the call had ended. But the photo was still there, the image of the shadowy figure in the hallway. Only now, there was something new in the photo. Standing behind the figure was another shape, smaller but unmistakable. It was him. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. He had turned off his phone, but the image of himself in the photo lingered in his mind like a haunting refrain. Why was he in the photo? Why did Edward Carlisle look so much like him? And why did that voice, the one whispering, "Why?" feel like it was pulling him deeper into something he didn't understand? Liam's thoughts churned relentlessly until he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his jacket, the folder Sarah had left behind, and headed out into the night. He didn't know where he was going, but sitting in his apartment felt like waiting to be consumed by the same darkness that haunted the courthouse. The streets were quiet, deserted, as he wandered aimlessly. The cold air bit at his skin, but it did little to numb the storm of fear and confusion inside him. He found himself walking toward the outskirts of town, where the courthouse loomed in the distance like a dark monolith against the night sky. He didn't want to go back. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, to run in the opposite direction. But something was pulling him, an invisible thread that he couldn't sever. When he reached the courthouse, he stopped at the gates. The building was dark, the windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. He clutched the folder tightly in his hands, as if it could shield him from whatever was waiting inside. Taking a deep breath, Liam pushed the gates open and stepped onto the grounds. The air inside the courthouse was colder than before, biting and unnatural. His footsteps echoed in the empty halls, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. This time, he wasn't here for answers, he was here to confront whatever was haunting him. He needed to understand why this place had chosen him, why it wouldn't let him go. He made his way to the main courtroom, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was exactly as he had left it, the chairs arranged neatly, the judge's bench towering over everything like a sentinel. But there was something new. On the floor, carved deep into the wood, was a series of words. Liam crouched down to get a closer look, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The blood remembers. Liam recoiled, his heart racing. The blood remembers. What did that mean? Before he could process it, a sound echoed through the courtroom, a faint, low hum that seemed to rise from the very walls. And then the voices started. They were faint at first, like the whispers on Sarah's recording. But as they grew louder, Liam could make out words, fragmented and overlapping. Justice, betrayal, blood. Liam stumbled backward, his back hitting the judge's bench. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere, surrounding him, suffocating him. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. Liam's flashlight flickered, the beam of light wavering as if struggling to stay alive. In the dim glow, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The shadowy figure was back, standing in the doorway. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it stood a line of figures, their forms barely visible in the darkness. They were smaller, frilier, but their presence was no less menacing. Liam's breath caught in his throat as the figures stepped forward, one by one. They moved in unison, their footsteps silent as they closed in on him. "Stay back!" Liam shouted, his voice cracking. But they didn't stop. Liam scrambled to his feet, clutching the folder to his chest as if it could protect him. He backed away, his heart pounding, until his back hit the wall. The figures stopped a few feet away, their hollow faces turned toward him. For a moment, everything was still. And then, one of them spoke. "You don't belong here." The voice was hollow, cold, and it sent shivers down Liam's spine. I don't understand," Liam stammered. Another figure stepped forward. This one was smaller, its form almost childlike. It tilted its head, as if studying him. "Why?" it whispered. Liam's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor. "Why what? What do you want from me?" The figures didn't answer. Instead, the childlike figure raised its hand, pointing to the judge's bench. Liam turned to look, and his blood ran cold. On the bench sat a book, old, leather-bound, and covered in dust. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to pulse with an eerie light. "What is that?" Liam whispered. The figures didn't respond. They simply stood there, waiting. Liam hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run. But something drew him to the book, an invisible force pulling him closer. He reached out with trembling hands and opened it. The pages were filled with names, thousands of them, written in spidery handwriting. As he flipped through, he noticed something strange. The names were listed chronologically, but the most recent entries were written in red ink. When he reached the last page, his heart stopped. His name was there. Liam Harper. The ink was still wet. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very walls. Liam slammed the book shut and stumbled backward, his mind racing. "What does this mean?" he shouted. "Why is my name here?" The figures didn't move, didn't speak. They simply stared at him, their hollow faces unyielding. And then, the judge's bench began to shake. The wood groaned and splintered as the bench collapsed in on itself, revealing a gaping hole in the floor. From the darkness below, a cold wind blew, carrying with it the faint sound of screaming. Liam stared into the abyss, his body frozen in terror. And then, from the darkness, a hand reached out. For a moment, Liam could only stare at the hand emerging from the black void beneath the courthouse floor. It was pale, almost skeletal, with long fingers that twitched and stretched as if testing the air. Then it moved. The hand clawed at the edge of the hole, gripping the floorboards with unnatural strength. Slowly, something began to rise from the abyss, a figure cloaked in shadows, its form barely discernible in the flickering light of Liam's flashlight. Liam scrambled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He was frozen, trapped by the oppressive presence of whatever was emerging from the darkness. The figure straightened, its head tilting toward Liam. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a swirling mass of darkness, as if the void itself had taken human form. And then, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was like a chorus, layered and discordant, each word vibrating in Liam's chest. I don't understand," Liam stammered, his voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and unnatural. The other shadowy figures in the room seemed to retreat, fading into the darkness as this new presence took center stage. "You carry the stain," it said. "The blood remembers. The debt remains unpaid." Liam's mind raced. The words made no sense, yet they filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. "What debt? What stain? I don't even know you." The figure stopped just a few feet away, its towering form casting an oppressive shadow over him. "You are bound to this place," it said. "By blood. By betrayal. By time itself." Before Liam could respond, the figure raised one hand and pointed to the folder clutched in his trembling hands. "Open it." Liam hesitated, his grip tightening on the folder. He didn't want to obey, didn't want to see whatever new horror awaited inside. But the figure's presence was suffocating, and he knew he had no choice. With shaking hands, he opened the folder and pulled out the documents inside. The first page was a photocopy of an old birth certificate. At first glance, it seemed irrelevant, just another piece of historical paperwork. But then he saw the name. Edward Carlyle. Liam's stomach turned. He flipped to the next page, then the next, scanning the information with growing dread. The folder was filled with records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, all tracing the lineage of Edward Carlyle. And then he saw it. His own name, listed among the descendants. "No," Liam whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible. This has to be some kind of mistake." "There is no mistake," the figure said. "You are his blood. And his blood carries the stain." Liam's mind reeled. He had always known his family history was complicated, but he'd never imagined this. He was a descendant of Edward Carlyle, the man whose trial had cursed the courthouse. "What does this have to do with me?" Liam demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "I didn't do anything. I didn't even know." The figure leaned closer, its shadow enveloping him. "The sins of the past are never truly buried," it said. "They fester. They grow. And they demand retribution." The ground beneath Liam's feet began to shake, the entire courthouse groaning as if it were alive. The hole in the floor widened, the black void spreading outward like a stain. Liam stumbled, barely keeping his balance. He looked around, searching for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in, trapping him in the room. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. The figure extended its hand, palm up. "Choose." "Choose what?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the whispers returned, louder this time, a deafening cacophony that drowned out Liam's thoughts. Images flashed through his mind, visions of the courthouse, the trial, Edward Carlyle standing before the judge, his face twisted in rage and despair. Liam saw Carlyle's execution, the rope tightening around his neck, his final words echoing through the chamber, "This place will never forget." "Neither will I." The visions shifted, showing Liam himself, standing in the same courtroom, his name being called, his guilt proclaimed. "No," Liam said, clutching his head. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But the figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming. "Choose," it repeated. Liam realized with a sinking feeling that he didn't have a choice. Whatever this entity wanted, it wouldn't let him leave until he played its game. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure extended its hand further, revealing a small, rusted key. "Unlock the truth," it said. Liam hesitated, then reached out to take the key. The moment his fingers touched it, the courtroom dissolved around him. He was standing in a different place now, a cold, dark cell. The walls were damp, the air thick with the stench of decay. He could hear distant screams, faint and haunting, echoing through the halls. In the corner of the cell sat a figure, hunched and motionless. "Edward Carlyle?" Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stirred, turning to face him. It was Carlyle, but he was barely recognizable. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones. "You," Carlyle said, his voice a rasp. "You carry my burden." "What burden?" Liam demanded. "Why am I here?" Carlyle's expression twisted into something between anger and sorrow. "They took everything from me, my family, my life. And now, they take you." Before Liam could respond, Carlyle lunged at him, his hands closing around Liam's throat. The world spun, the cell dissolving into darkness as Carlyle's voice echoed in his ears. "You are mine now." Liam woke with a start, gasping for air. He was back in the courtroom, sprawled on the floor. The folder was gone, the shadowy figures nowhere to be seen. But the key was still in his hand. He stared at it, his mind racing. The courthouse was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But Liam knew it wasn't over. He slipped the key into his pocket and stood, his legs shaking. He didn't know what the key opened or what awaited him, but one thing was certain. The courthouse wasn't done with him yet. Liam stumbled out of the courtroom into the dark, silent corridors of the courthouse. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the building itself was alive and watching his every move. His fingers curled tightly around the rusted key in his pocket, its cold surface biting into his skin. The whispers had stopped, the shadowy figures vanished, but Liam's sense of dread only grew. He felt like he was walking through a living nightmare, each step taking him closer to something he didn't want to find. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. Somehow, he knew that the key was the answer, or at least the next step in this nightmare. He stopped at a junction where the hallway split into two. The left path led to the offices and records room, while the right led to the basement. Liam hesitated, his flashlight flickering as if in protest. The basement felt wrong, like a wound festering beneath the surface of the courthouse. But the key seemed to tug at him, pulling him toward the stairs leading down into the darkness. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, descending step by step into the basement. The basement was colder than the rest of the courthouse, the chill seeping into Liam's bones. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets, their metal surfaces rusted and covered in dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in the stale air. Liam's flashlight beam danced across the room, illuminating the shadows but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. He felt a pang of frustration. Why had the key brought him here? What was he supposed to find? As if in response, he heard a faint sound, a soft thump that echoed through the basement. Liam froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound came again, louder this time, like something knocking from the other side of a wall. He followed the noise, his footsteps hesitant. It led him to a section of the basement he hadn't noticed before, a set of shelves pushed against the far wall. The knocking grew louder as he approached, the sound vibrating through the air. Liam hesitated for a moment before grabbing the edge of the shelf and pulling it aside. Behind it was a door. It was old, made of heavy wood, with deep scratches gouged into its surface. A tarnished lock hung from the handle, its keyhole large and jagged. Liam pulled the rusted key from his pocket, his hands trembling. The moment the key slid into the lock, the knocking stopped. He turned the key, the mechanism groaning in protest, and the door creaked open. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the earth. The air was colder here, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and decay. Liam hesitated at the top of the stairs, his flashlight flickering as if warning him not to go any further. But he couldn't turn back. Not now. He descended slowly, each step feeling like a descent into a deeper layer of hell. The walls were rough, carved from stone, and the sound of his breathing echoed around him. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a cavernous chamber. The room was circular, the walls lined with ancient symbols carved deep into the stone. In the center of the room stood a large stone table, its surface stained dark with something Liam didn't want to identify. On the table lay a book. It was massive, its leather cover cracked and blackened with age. The same symbols that adorned the walls were etched into its cover, pulsating faintly with an eerie light. Liam approached the table cautiously, his flashlight beam revealing more unsettling details. The floor around the table was littered with bones, human bones, scattered haphazardly as if discarded after some macabre ritual. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to focus on the book. It was open, its pages filled with spidery handwriting that seemed to writhe and shift as he tried to read it. The text was incomprehensible, written in a language he didn't recognize. But as he stared at the pages, the words seemed to take shape, forming sentences he could understand. The debt of blood. The curse of betrayal. Bound by the sins of the father. Liam's vision blurred, his head pounding as the words burned into his mind. He staggered backward, clutching his head. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. And then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Edward Carlyle. But this time, he wasn't the broken, frail man Liam had seen in the vision. He was whole, his presence commanding and terrifying. His eyes burned with an otherworldly light, his expression a twisted mix of anger and triumph. "You found it," Carlyle said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "The source of it all. What is this place?" Liam demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" Carlyle gestured to the book. "This is where it began. The pact. The curse. The bloodline that ties you to me." Liam shook his head. "I don't understand. I've never been part of this. I don't even know you." "But your blood does," Carlyle said, stepping closer. "You carry the stain, the mark of betrayal. Your ancestor swore an oath to protect me, to stand by me during the trial. But he didn't. He abandoned me, condemned me to die. And with his betrayal, he cursed us both." Liam's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor. "I didn't choose this," he whispered. "I didn't ask for any of this." "None of us choose our fate," Carlyle said, his voice cold. "But we all must face it." He extended his hand, and the book on the table began to glow. "The curse can only be broken with a sacrifice. Blood for blood." Liam stared at him, horrified. "What are you saying?" "You must make a choice," Carlyle said. "Offer your blood, or the curse will consume you, and everyone you love." The room seemed to close in on Liam, the weight of Carlyle's words crushing him. He looked at the book, its pages pulsating with an ominous light, and then back at Carlyle. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Carlyle's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of humanity breaking through the darkness. "Because you're the only one left. The bloodline ends with you." Liam's mind raced. He didn't trust Carlyle, but he couldn't deny the truth in his words. The courthouse, the whispers, the visions, it all pointed to something far beyond his understanding. He stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists. "If I do this, if I make this sacrifice, will it end? Will the curse finally be broken?" Carlyle nodded. "The courthouse will be cleansed. The voices will be silenced. And you will be free." Liam looked at the book one last time, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he could trust Carlyle, but he had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the book. Weeks passed, but the feeling never fully left him. Liam had tried to put the courthouse behind him, tried to convince himself that the nightmare was over. Yet, there was a nagging sensation that clung to him like an invisible thread, tugging at his mind in the quietest moments. The scars on his palms had faded, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. They were still there, faint, like the remnants of an old wound that never quite healed. They didn't hurt, but they felt wrong. As though they were a constant reminder of something unfinished, something unresolved. Liam tried to focus on his everyday life, returning to his job, spending time with his friends. He even tried dating again, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. But it was as if something was always just out of reach. He would be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly freeze, his mind drifting back to the courthouse, to the things he had seen, the voices he had heard. One night, after a long day at work, Liam sat in his apartment staring out the window. The city below was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He rubbed his palms together, feeling the faint warmth of the scars as he did so. The memories of the courthouse lingered in his thoughts. The cold stone walls, the figure of Edward Carlyle looming over him, the strange, desperate figures who had appeared in the basement. The book. The blood. And the choice he had made. Was it the right choice? Had he truly broken the curse? Or had he done something far worse, something that would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't even understand? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. It was over. The courthouse had been sealed, the records erased, and there was nothing left to fear. Everything would be fine. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. That something was still waiting. The first strange occurrence happened when he was alone in his apartment late one evening. Liam had just gotten out of the shower, towel draped around his waist, when he noticed something in the mirror. A figure stood behind him, just barely visible in the reflection. A faint outline, a shadow against the dim light. Liam spun around, but the room was empty. His heart thudded in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps as he glanced over his shoulder, eyes darting to every corner of the room. Nothing. He stared at the mirror again, but there was no trace of the figure. Just his own reflection, looking back at him, wide-eyed and confused. His mind raced. Was it the stress? The lingering effects of the curse? But no matter how much he tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, a part of him couldn't shake the cold fear that gripped him. As the night wore on, Liam tried to distract himself. He watched TV, cleaned, even tried reading. But every little sound, every creak of the floorboards, made him jump. He couldn't relax. Every time he turned a corner, he half expected to see that figure standing there, watching him. And then there was the whisper. It was soft at first, so quiet that he thought it might have been the wind or the hum of the refrigerator. But then it came again, clearer this time, carrying with it a weight of undeniable urgency. Liam. He froze. The voice was unmistakable, and it was coming from behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his skin crawled with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Slowly, he turned. Nothing. But the whisper came again, this time louder, more forceful. Liam. Liam's breath hitched in his throat. He staggered back, eyes wide, as if the voice had physically shaken him. His pulse raced, and his mind raced even faster. There was no way. This couldn't be happening. He looked around the apartment, but there was no one there. No one except him. Still, the whispering continued. Not in the air around him, but inside his mind. A cold, insistent voice, like a memory clawing its way to the surface. It's not over. The words froze him in place. His body stiffened, and the air seemed to thicken, the room growing darker. The walls seemed to pulse with a low hum, as if the very building itself was alive, breathing. His fingers curled into fists. No. No, this couldn't be real. Liam spun around, his eyes darting around the room in panic. Was this part of the curse? Was it some unfinished business, some consequence of the sacrifice he had made? He looked toward the hallway that led to his bedroom, the door slightly ajar. There was something wrong about it. As if drawn by an invisible force, Liam moved toward the door. His legs felt heavy, his body stiff with dread, but he couldn't stop himself. His hands trembled as he pushed the door open. The room was exactly as he had left it. Bed made, clothes scattered on the floor, nothing out of place. But as he stepped inside, the air felt charged, thick and unnatural. And there, on the far wall, just beneath the window, was a small, dark stain on the carpet. Liam's heart skipped a beat. He moved closer, crouching to get a better look. The stain was fresh, darker than the rest of the carpet. It looked like blood. His breath caught in his throat, and he stood up quickly, his eyes snapping to the doorframe. That's when he saw it. A shadow. It wasn't like the shadows in the rest of the room. It was darker, more distinct, its edges sharp. And it was moving. Liam froze, his entire body seizing with fear. The shadow shifted, stretching toward him. Then, slowly, it began to form into something more solid, something human-like. Liam backed away, his mind screaming for him to leave, to get out of the room. But his legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as the figure took shape. A tall figure, standing just inside the doorway. It had no face, just a featureless, black void where the eyes should have been. The darkness seemed to swirl around it, as if it were made of shadow itself. You thought you were free. The voice was cold, empty, without a hint of human warmth. Liam's blood ran cold, and he took an instinctive step back, bumping into the wall. But you were wrong. The figure moved closer, its form growing clearer with each step. Liam's breath caught in his throat. His hand reached out for the door, but it slammed shut on its own. He was trapped. Who are you? Liam's voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear. The figure's form flickered as it stepped forward, its shadowy form now inches from him. You should know, Liam. You were never meant to escape. The curse never ended. It's just begun. The darkness consumed the room. And with it, all hope. Story 2. The old house stood at the end of the street, its silhouette like a shadow against the pale moonlight. The crumbling stone walls were thick with years of neglect, covered in creeping ivy and moss. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring out into nothingness. No one could remember a time when the house had been full of life. No one even knew who built it, or why it had been abandoned in the first place. All anyone knew were the rumors. Some said it had once been a home to a family, but that was before the fire. The fire that destroyed everything. And yet, when you looked at the house, it didn't seem to have been burned at all. The walls were still intact, the roof still sturdy enough to hold off a storm. But no one lived there anymore. No one dared to. Not since the disappearances started. People in town whispered about the things that happened to anyone who stayed too long. How people would go in, curious, daring, or foolish, but never come out the same. There were stories of voices heard through the walls, shadows that seemed to move when no one was looking, and figures that appeared in the windows at night, watching from within. Tonight was different, though. It wasn't the full moon that made the air feel so heavy, nor was it the silence that filled the streets. It was something else. Something inexplicable. Something that gnawed at the edge of Sarah's thoughts and pulled her toward the house like a moth to a flame. Sarah stood at the end of the overgrown path, the smell of damp earth and decay thick in the air. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, an instinctive warning. Yet she didn't turn away. Just a quick look, she whispered to herself, trying to convince her shaking hands that she was in control. She could already hear her friends' teasing voices echoing in her mind, urging her to be brave, to face her fear. They hadn't come with her, of course. None of them were brave enough. But Sarah couldn't stop herself. She had to know. Had to see what was inside. If she didn't, she knew she would never be able to leave it behind. The curiosity was like a fire burning deep in her chest. She took a step forward, the crunch of dry leaves beneath her feet breaking the stillness. The porch creaked under her weight as she reached for the door. Her heart thudded in her chest, the adrenaline making her hands tremble even more. For a moment, she hesitated, but only for a moment. "Just a quick look," she repeated, and pushed the door open. The door swung wide with a groan, its rusty hinges protesting the movement. Cold air rushed out, wrapping around her like fingers. She stepped inside. The house smelled old, musty, like dust and forgotten things. The floors were covered in a thick layer of grime, the walls cracked and peeling. The flashlight in her hand flickered once before staying steady. It cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, which seemed to shift and twitch, playing tricks on her mind. But it wasn't the condition of the house that caught her attention. It was the feeling in the air, heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was alive, aware of her every movement. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stepped further into the darkness. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of her footsteps. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it. A rocking chair, sitting in the farthest corner of the room, moving slowly back and forth. Who would leave a chair rocking like that? She froze, her heart racing in her chest. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. It wasn't normal. It shouldn't have been moving. Her eyes flickered to the door behind her, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, as if some unseen force had slammed it from the inside. The sound echoed through the house, sending a shiver down her spine. The rocking chair kept moving. Back and forth. Back and forth. "Sarah." The whisper was so soft that she almost didn't hear it. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling the empty room. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, searching for the source of the voice. "Sarah." It came again, louder this time, but still distant, as if it was a voice from far away. She felt the hairs on her neck stand on end. She couldn't have heard it. It couldn't have been real. But it was. Her flashlight flickered again, and in the split second of darkness, she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, a figure, standing just beyond the threshold of the room. Her pulse quickened. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the rocking chair. But now, it was moving faster. Back and forth. Back and forth. The whispers came again, and this time, they were clearer, more distinct. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come here." Her breath caught in her throat, and her legs felt like lead. What was that? It wasn't her imagination. The words were unmistakable. They were spoken by someone, or something, that wasn't her. A deep feeling of dread settled in her chest. Her mind raced. Who's here? What do they want? The rocking chair suddenly stopped moving, its momentum gone. For a moment, the house was still, as if holding its breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate sound, something heavy thudded to the floor behind her. She whirled around, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. Nothing. Nothing but the darkness. Nothing but the stillness. But it didn't feel empty. Her breathing was sharp, panicked. She didn't know if she was imagining things anymore or if something was truly here, with her. The temperature in the room had dropped, and her breath was visible in the air, forming small clouds of mist with every exhale. That's when she heard it again. A giggle. Light, playful, and unmistakably childlike. It echoed from the far end of the room, and Sarah's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her eyes darting to the walls, the ceiling, the floor. But there was nothing. No one. What was happening? Her thoughts were scattered, her mind on the verge of breaking. She didn't know what was real anymore. The house felt wrong. It felt alive. The giggle came again, louder this time. It didn't come from anywhere she could see. It wasn't a sound of this world. The lights flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, she saw it. A face. Pale, empty eyes. Hollow. Staring at her from the doorway. Sarah. The voice. Clear now. Familiar. The last thing she heard was the sound of her own name, whispered in the silence, before the darkness consumed her. Sarah's mind was a blur. Her eyes blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the complete darkness. She could feel the cold floor beneath her, the damp, uneven surface pressing against her skin. Her head spun, and she tried to shake away the dizziness that clung to her like a thick fog. What happened? The last thing she remembered was that cold, unmistakable whisper of her name, her own name, followed by that fleeting glimpse of a face. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly sat up, her senses heightened, trying to make sense of the silence surrounding her. Her hands touched the floor beneath her. It was hard, but it wasn't the same dusty surface from earlier. The feeling beneath her fingertips was smoother. Softer. Like polished stone. Stone. Her breath hitched, and she slowly raised her head, squinting into the darkness. She could see nothing. The house, once so vast and full of eerie noises, now felt suffocatingly close. The walls seemed to close in on her as she gathered the strength to stand. Her legs were shaky, but she pushed herself to her feet. The air was heavy, thicker than before, and the smell of mildew mixed with something else, something metallic, almost like blood. Sarah's stomach churned. She didn't know how much more of this she could take, but the strange pull in her chest, the same feeling that had led her to the house, still gripped her. She couldn't leave. Not yet. She needed to understand what was happening here. She needed to know what this place wanted from her. Slowly, cautiously, she moved forward, her hands brushing against the walls for guidance. She couldn't remember where she had fallen. The house had distorted itself in the brief moment of darkness. Was she in a different part of the house now? She couldn't be sure. A small flicker of light appeared in the distance. It was weak, almost like a candle's flame flickering from far away, but it was enough to guide her. Hello. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to call out. Is anyone there? No response. Just silence. The house didn't answer her. As she took another step toward the light, a sudden creak made her freeze. The sound was so familiar now, a deep groan that came from somewhere above her. She knew the house had its own language, its own rhythm, but that sound, it didn't belong to the house. It was something else. She turned, her heartbeat racing again. At first, she thought it was just a trick of her eyes. But as her gaze shifted upward, her breath caught. There, at the top of the narrow staircase, was a figure. A silhouette. It stood motionless, bathed in darkness. Its shape was difficult to make out, but the presence, it was undeniable. It was tall, its form lanky and unnaturally thin. It stood perfectly still, watching her. Her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't breathe. For a split second, she thought she saw it move, just a small twitch of its arm, but the instant the thought crossed her mind, it vanished. Her eyes darted to the staircase again, but there was nothing. Just the empty, gaping void of the hallway above. Am I losing my mind? She shook her head, desperate to convince herself she hadn't seen what she thought she had. The figure had been a shadow, a figment of her imagination. It had to have been. Yet, she couldn't ignore the feeling. The air was different now. Heavier. Like something, or someone, was waiting for her. She turned back to the flickering light. It was still there, drawing her in, and this time, she couldn't resist. There was something she needed to see, something she had to find. With every step, the house felt more suffocating. The walls seemed to close in as she moved deeper into the darkness. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, as if the house was waiting for her to do something. Then she reached the door. It was tucked away at the end of the hallway, nearly hidden by shadows. The light she had seen earlier was coming from underneath the door. The door itself was old, the wood rotting around the edges, but there was something unusual about it. It didn't match the rest of the house. It was newer. She hesitated. The feeling in her chest had grown stronger now. This was it. The place where everything would be explained. Where all the whispers and shadows would finally make sense. But there was fear, too, an instinct that screamed for her to turn around, to leave the house and never come back. But her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She reached for the doorknob. The instant her hand touched it, a jolt of cold ran through her. The door creaked open slowly, revealing what was inside. At first, all she could see was darkness. The same darkness that had swallowed her before. But then, slowly, her eyes adjusted. There was something in the room. Something old. An old bed, the sheets torn and yellowed with age, sat in the center of the room. A wooden wardrobe stood against the wall, the door slightly ajar. And in the farthest corner, a small rocking chair. The chair was still. But the room wasn't. The air was heavy, suffused with a strange, unidentifiable smell. As Sarah stepped further into the room, she could feel the temperature drop, her breath becoming visible in the frigid air. She took a few more steps, her eyes scanning every corner, every surface, every inch of the room. Then, something caught her eye. The wall, beneath the window, was different. Not like the rest of the room, which was old and decaying. This part of the wall was new. Freshly painted, as if someone had tried to hide it. Sarah's curiosity led her forward. She reached out and placed her hand on the wall, feeling the smooth surface. But as she touched it, a sudden pressure seemed to rise beneath her fingertips. She pulled her hand back instinctively, her heart racing. The wall, it wasn't just fresh paint. It felt wrong. What is this? Without thinking, she pushed harder against the wall, her hands trembling. Something gave way. A loud, unsettling click echoed through the room. The wall shifted. The wall opened. Behind it, hidden in the shadows, was a doorway. A dark, narrow passage. And the faint sound of whispers coming from deep inside. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. It was her name again. But this time, the voice was different. It wasn't soft. It wasn't playful. It was cold. And it was waiting. The air felt thick as Sarah stared at the narrow passageway that had appeared in front of her. It was dark, impossibly dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light whole. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating through her body as she stood frozen, staring at the open door. The whispers from within grew louder now, as if someone, was beckoning her. Sarah. The voice was clearer now. Cold, distant, yet somehow intimate, like it was right beside her ear. She shivered, the chill creeping down her spine, but she couldn't look away. There was no turning back. Her body, her mind, everything seemed to draw her toward the passageway, against her better judgment, against the fear that gripped her. What's behind that door? The question echoed in her mind, drowning out the whispers, but it only deepened her sense of unease. Her thoughts were spinning, each one more frantic than the last. It didn't make sense. The house had changed, she had changed since she first entered. The air, the weight of everything around her, felt different. Like something was shifting, something unseen and wrong. But still, the pull was there. Stronger than the fear, stronger than the warnings that screamed at her from deep inside. She stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath her as if protesting her decision. She glanced back at the room she had just left, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows. The rocking chair was still there, unmoving. The room, though unsettling, was normal, in comparison. But what was waiting beyond that door, down that narrow passage, felt alive. With a deep breath, Sarah moved forward, her fingers brushing against the wooden frame of the door. The instant she touched it, the temperature dropped further, an almost tangible coldness that made her skin prickle. She pushed the door all the way open. A wave of dark, damp air hit her, thick and heavy, like it had been trapped there for years. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw something in the shadows. Something tall and thin, standing just out of reach. But when she blinked, it was gone. The passage stretched ahead of her, the walls closing in. There was no turning back. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of her breath and the quiet thrum of her racing heartbeat. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to leave the house, to run, but her feet moved forward, drawn by the same force that had led her inside. Each step seemed heavier than the last, her legs protesting as she continued down the dark hallway. The air grew colder, sharper, as she went further. The walls were no longer smooth, rough, jagged edges lined the stone that surrounded her. It felt as though the passage was being carved as she walked, the darkness behind her growing thicker and the walls closing in tighter. Something was watching her. She could feel it. Something in the shadows. Something waiting. Don't look back. The thought came unbidden, but it felt so strong, so urgent, that she couldn't resist. She didn't dare look behind her, even as her gut twisted, telling her that something was there. Watching. The passage narrowed further, forcing her to take smaller steps, but she couldn't stop now. There was no way to go but forward. And then, she saw it. A light. A faint, flickering light, barely visible in the distance. It was different from the candlelight she had seen before. This light was unnatural, flickering in a way that made her head spin. It wasn't just light. It was alive. The shadows around it twisted and writhed, as though they had a life of their own. Sarah reached the end of the passage and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The light came from behind a door, another door, ancient and covered in dust, with symbols carved deep into its wood. The same symbols she had seen on the walls earlier, in her dreams. Was this real? Or was she dreaming? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that the door was waiting for her. Like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She raised her hand, trembling, and reached for the doorknob. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, the whispers returned, louder than ever, rushing at her from all sides. They were no longer distant and disembodied, they were inside her head now, filling her thoughts, her very soul. Sarah, the voice was no longer cold, it was desperate, pleading. Sarah, please. Her hand jerked back, but something deep inside her told her that she had to open the door. That there was something inside, something important. The voices had led her here. She had to open the door. With a deep breath, she turned the doorknob. It groaned in protest, the hinges straining under the weight of years. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. At first, all Sarah could see was dust, thick, heavy dust that had settled over everything. The air was stale, suffocating, and the only sound was the faint buzz of a dim light hanging from the ceiling. But then, her eyes adjusted. Her breath hitched as she saw what was in the room. There was a small table, covered with old, yellowed papers. Scattered on the floor around the table were strange, broken objects, pieces of glass, pieces of wood, things she couldn't make sense of. But what caught her eye wasn't the table, or the objects. It was the mirror. The large, cracked mirror stood against the wall, its surface tarnished with age. But as Sarah's eyes met the reflection, her blood ran cold. There, standing in the reflection, was herself. But not like she was now. This version of Sarah was different, hollow-eyed, with dark circles beneath her eyes, her skin pale, almost gray. Her reflection moved on its own, staring at her with an expression that was twisted into something unrecognizable. No. No, this can't be real. Her heart raced as she reached out, touching the cold surface of the mirror. The second her fingers made contact, the reflection smiled. A wide, unsettling grin that spread across its face in a way that didn't belong to her. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah." The voice was her own, but it wasn't. It was wrong. It was distorted. And then, the reflection spoke again. The words came, but they weren't meant for her. "You're next." Sarah stumbled back from the mirror, her pulse racing, her mind reeling. Her hand hovered in the air, still trembling from the contact with the cold glass. The reflection of herself, twisted, hollow-eyed, and smiling in that grotesque way, was burned into her mind. It wasn't just a reflection. It felt like something alive, something that knew her, something that was watching her from the other side of the glass. She shook her head, desperate to erase the image, but it lingered in her thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The air in the room had become thick with a sense of impending doom. The stale smell of dust mixed with something else, something metallic. "No. No, this isn't real." Sarah repeated the words in her head like a mantra, trying to force her mind to make sense of what was happening. She had to get out. She had to leave this place before it consumed her too. But her feet wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The reflection was still there, staring back at her with that terrifying grin. It seemed to be mocking her, taunting her, as if it knew the fear that had taken root in her heart. "You're next," the voice echoed in her mind, repeating itself over and over like a curse. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. But they felt real. Too real. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah tore her gaze from the mirror and forced herself to turn away. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air heavier with each breath. She had to leave. But there was nowhere to go. The house seemed to have closed in on her, trapping her in its dark, suffocating grip. As she backed away from the mirror, her foot caught on something. She stumbled but quickly regained her balance, her heart still pounding in her chest. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the papers scattered across the table. They were old, yellowed with age, some torn and crumpled, others still intact, as though they had been placed there deliberately. "What is this?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her mind telling her to walk away, to leave everything behind. But her curiosity, that insatiable curiosity, drove her to step forward and examine the papers. She reached out and picked up the nearest sheet, carefully unrolling it. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, almost illegible, but one word stood out. "Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat. The word was written again and again, in varying sizes and angles, almost as if the writer had been consumed by it. Each repetition of her name sent a cold shiver through her. The paper was soaked with something, darker than ink, thicker. Blood? No. It couldn't be blood. But the thought gnawed at her. She quickly set the paper down and moved to the next one. This one was different. The writing on it was more coherent, but the words were disturbing. "I can hear them. They're getting closer. I can feel their presence all around me. They want me. But I won't let them in. Not again. I won't let them take me." The words were jagged, scratched out, as though the writer had been in a panic when they wrote them. But it was the last sentence that caught Sarah's attention. The writer had been terrified, but it was clear that they were trying to hold on to something. To keep something at bay. What were they trying to stop? As Sarah continued to read the papers, one phrase repeated itself over and over again: "The room is waking up. The room is waking up." What could that mean? The house itself? Or something else? Her hands began to shake as she flipped through more of the papers, her mind racing. The fear that had been simmering in the back of her mind began to bubble up to the surface. This wasn't a normal house. It wasn't just a place with strange occurrences. Something was inside it. Something alive. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound, a scraping noise, coming from behind her. She whipped around, her heart leaping in her chest, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. The mirror, the table, the papers, everything was still in place. No sign of the thing that had made the sound. But the feeling was there. The presence. It was behind her, watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The whispers, the ones that had been so distant before, were growing louder again. This time, they didn't feel like they were coming from the house. They came from inside her head. They were her own thoughts, but they weren't her own voice. "You shouldn't have come, Sarah." The voice was sharp now, as though it was speaking from the deepest, darkest part of her mind. She spun around again, but the room was still empty. The light flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. She could feel the temperature drop, her breath fogging in the cold air. The mirror, the reflection, was gone. It had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. But she could still hear the voice, still feel the presence. It was closing in. She turned back to the papers, frantic now, her eyes scanning the words for anything that might explain what was happening. Her hands moved quickly, touching each sheet, searching for answers. And then, her fingers brushed against something cold. A small, hidden compartment on the underside of the table. She quickly lifted it, her heart racing. Inside, there was a small, leather-bound book. It was old, the edges worn and frayed, as if it had been handled countless times. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened it, the pages brittle beneath her touch. The book was filled with symbols, strange markings that she couldn't understand. But there was one thing that was unmistakable. Her name. Again. Sarah. The words in the book weren't in any language Sarah recognized, but the symbols, the lines that twisted and turned, seemed familiar. They seemed to speak to her, calling to her from some dark, buried place deep inside her mind. She turned the pages quickly, scanning for anything she could understand. And then, at the very end, she found it. A single sentence. It was written in bold, unmistakable letters. "The room will take what it needs. And you are the key." The words made her blood run cold. Her hands shook as she closed the book and looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. The room, the key, what does this mean? Her mind raced as she glanced around the room. The house felt alive now, alive in a way she couldn't explain. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floorboards felt like it was watching her. She had uncovered something, something she wasn't meant to see. And now, it was too late. The room was waking up. And Sarah was the key. The weight of the book in her hands was almost unbearable. The words she had read, the cryptic, unsettling phrase, still echoed in her mind, replaying over and over again. "The room will take what it needs. And you are the key." What did it mean? Why her? Why was she involved in this twisted puzzle that the house seemed to have been waiting for? As Sarah held the book, the air around her seemed to grow heavier. The whispers, soft at first, had begun to surround her once more. They were no longer just a distant hum. No, they were all around her, louder now, closer. They slithered into her thoughts, weaving through her mind, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You're the key, Sarah." The words repeated themselves with increasing urgency, like a chant, like a prayer, one that she couldn't escape. She closed the book with trembling hands, the dark weight of its pages sinking deep into her gut. The house had been waiting for her, had it always been waiting for her? Her body ached with the realization that this wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't an accident that she had wandered into this house, into this nightmare. The house had chosen her. The room around her seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter with every breath she took. She could feel the temperature drop even further, the air growing thick and cold, suffocating her with its unnatural chill. The shadows, those dark, shifting forms, began to stretch and writhe at the edges of her vision. They were no longer just figments of her imagination. They were real. They were alive. Get out. Get out now, her mind screamed, but her body refused to move. The weight of the book in her hands, the pull of the house, kept her rooted to the spot. Something was wrong. Something was waking up. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, their voices intertwining with one another. Some of the voices were familiar. They were her own thoughts, her own fears, but distorted, twisted in ways she couldn't understand. Others were colder, more ancient, like echoes of the past, reaching out from the very bones of the house. Sarah staggered backward, dropping the book to the floor. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. The floor beneath her seemed to groan, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting beneath her feet. She could feel the vibrations deep in her bones, the sense that the house was waking up, and she was the one who had triggered it. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she stumbled toward the door. Her hand reached for the knob, but it resisted, the door was no longer willing to let her go. It wanted her to stay. The whispers reached a crescendo, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. You can't leave, Sarah. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, harsh and unyielding, reverberating in her head. She yanked at the door again, harder this time, but it refused to open. The walls trembled, the floor creaked beneath her feet, and Sarah felt the pull of something deep inside the house. Something ancient and hungry. In that moment, she realized with a sickening certainty that she was trapped. There was no escape. Not anymore. She turned back to the room, her eyes scanning the space. The shadows had grown thicker, more solid. They stretched toward her, as though they were reaching out, pulling at her, trying to drag her into their suffocating embrace. And then, just as suddenly as the tension had built, it shattered. The whispers stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was silence, dead, suffocating silence. Then, a low rumble filled the air, like the sound of distant thunder, vibrating through the walls. The house seemed to groan in response, as though it was awakening from a long, deep slumber. The floor beneath Sarah's feet shook, and the walls cracked, sending spiderwebbing fractures across the room. The light overhead flickered, casting erratic, frenzied shadows that danced wildly across the walls. The air turned to ice. The shadows, the ones that had been lurking in the corners, now surged forward. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were things. Living things, with twisted faces, long, clawed hands, and eyes that burned with a cold, hungry light. They were reaching for her, moving in ways that defied logic, crawling along the walls, slithering across the floor, coming from every direction, trapping her in the center of the room. No. 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 Her words were lost in the chaos. Panic surged through her, tearing through every rational thought, every fragment of her sanity. She tried to scream, but her throat constricted, her voice lost in the suffocating silence that hung over the room. The shadows moved closer, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, sending jolts of ice through her body. Sarah stumbled backward, her eyes wild, but there was no place to go. There was no way to escape. She was surrounded. The door, The door that had been her only hope, was gone. Vanished, as though it had never existed. The room was sealed, suffocating her in its darkness. And then, she heard it. A voice, clearer than any whisper, louder than any scream, rang out from the center of the room. It was deep, ancient, and hungry. The voice filled her mind, twisting and distorting her thoughts, until she could hardly breathe. "It's time, Sarah." The voice rumbled through her very soul. "The room has woken. And you are the key." The shadows surged forward, engulfing her, their cold hands wrapping around her, pulling her toward the center of the room. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Everything in her screamed to fight, but her body refused to obey. The shadows squeezed tighter, their grip unyielding. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The shadows released her. The air warmed. The walls ceased trembling. The house was quiet once more. But Sarah wasn't alone. She looked up, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and saw it. In the center of the room stood the reflection of herself. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was her. The same hollow-eyed, twisted version of herself that had stared back at her in the mirror. This time, the figure didn't smile. It didn't laugh. It simply stared. It was her. And yet, it wasn't. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward her, as if to claim her. The message was clear. "You are mine." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stood there, staring at the figure in front of her. The thing that was her, but not her. Its hollow eyes bore into her with a chilling emptiness, and its smile, twisted, jagged, unnatural, was all teeth and darkness. She felt her knees tremble, her legs too weak to hold her upright. The weight of it, the sheer, suffocating presence of the thing before her, was too much. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her body refused to cooperate. Her mind screamed for her to escape, to do anything, but she was rooted to the spot, trapped in the grip of something she couldn't understand. It reached out a hand, its hand, and Sarah froze. The figure's hand, pale and cold, moved toward her, the fingers twitching slightly, as though it were about to touch her. She recoiled instinctively, but there was no space left to move. The walls were too close, and the shadows, those endless, dark tendrils, were creeping in, closing off her only escape. "No. No, I can't be here." Sarah's mind raced, trying to push away the fear, trying to rationalize, to find some way out of this nightmare. But there was no way out. Not anymore. Her hand shot out in desperation, grasping at the nearest object. It was the book. The same dark, leather-bound book that had seemed to contain so much power, and yet so much danger. She yanked it toward her, hoping, praying, that somehow it would offer her some form of salvation. The figure didn't stop. It kept advancing, its cold fingers inching closer to her face, closer to her neck. Sarah could feel its presence pressing in on her, suffocating her with its dark energy. But she didn't think. She just acted. With a scream, she opened the book, flipping through the brittle pages, her eyes wild. The shadows around her seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, watching her movements closely. It was almost as if the house itself was waiting to see what she would do. There has to be something in here. There has to be something. Her heart raced as she skimmed the pages, the symbols and words flashing by in a blur. She didn't understand most of it, couldn't understand it, but there was one page that seemed to stand out. It was different from the others. A simple drawing. It was a symbol, ancient and familiar, etched into the page in thick, dark lines. It resembled a twisted, jagged circle, like the thing that was standing in front of her. At the center was a sharp, jagged line, a crack in the middle, as though something had been broken. What is this? Her eyes scanned the words beneath it, frantic, trying to make sense of what they meant. They were in the same strange script, but she could make out a few recognizable words: broken, key, awake. Broken? What does that mean? She turned the page, her hands shaking violently, her pulse thundering in her ears. But the next page was worse. The drawing was clearer this time, more detailed. There were figures around the broken symbol, dark shapes that looked like twisted, distorted versions of people. They were trapped, bound by the symbol, their eyes wide in fear, their mouths open in silent screams. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The symbol is the house. The key. It's me. I'm the one who's broken. Sarah felt a cold wave of horror wash over her. She wasn't just trapped in this house. She was part of it. Something deep inside her, a part of her she hadn't known existed, was bound to the darkness that had been festering here for so long. And now, that darkness was waking up. It had been waiting for her, had been waiting for her to find it. The figure in front of her, her reflection, her twisted double, wasn't just a part of the house. It was her. It was what she had become, what she was always meant to be. And the house was going to claim her. No. Sarah whispered, a sob catching in her throat. This can't be happening. This can't be real. She clutched the book to her chest, feeling the cold weight of it, but it offered her no comfort. The figure in front of her smiled. It was not a kind smile, not even a human one. It was a smile of hunger. And then, with a voice that was both her own and not, it spoke. You should have stayed away, Sarah. The words were cold, dripping with malice. You are the key. And the room has waited long enough. The shadows swarmed around her again, encircling her like a dark, suffocating cloud. They clung to her, pressing against her skin, wrapping around her like chains. She gasped for air, but it was thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. And then, something inside her snapped. With a force she didn't know she had, Sarah threw the book to the ground. She screamed, a raw, guttural scream that came from the very depths of her being. Get out! Get out of my head! The figure in front of her recoiled, its smile faltering for the briefest of moments. The shadows seemed to hesitate, as though they weren't sure what to do. For a split second, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. But then it was gone. The figure lunged at her, its hands reaching out with inhuman speed, its fingers clawing for her throat. But Sarah was faster. She ducked, dodging the grasping hands, her mind spinning with terror. She ran toward the door, toward the exit, but as she reached for the handle, the door vanished. No. She turned around, her heart sinking as she realized the room had changed. It was no longer the same room. The walls were closing in, the ceiling pressing down on her. The shadows were moving, crawling, twisting around her, pulling her in every direction. You can't escape, Sarah, the voice echoed in her mind again. It was everywhere now, coming from the shadows, coming from the walls, coming from within her own head. You never could. Tears stung her eyes as she stumbled backward. She had to fight. She had to keep fighting. She reached into her pocket, her hand trembling, and pulled out the key. The key she had found earlier, the one she hadn't understood. It was warm to the touch now, as if it had absorbed the heat of her panic, her desperation. She raised it above her head, holding it in front of her like a weapon. The shadows shrieked, recoiling from the key. It was fighting back. The key was more than just a key. It was a weapon. It was her weapon. Sarah gritted her teeth. She was going to survive this. She had to survive. The figure in front of her raised its arms, and the shadows surged forward with renewed fury. But Sarah didn't back down. She held the key in front of her, pressing it against the air, as though it were a shield. The room trembled, and the shadows screamed. And then, there was a deafening silence. The shadows began to fade, slowly, reluctantly, as though they were being pulled away by some invisible force. The figure in front of her, her twisted reflection, stopped, its smile faltering. The air grew thick and still, as though the entire house was holding its breath. Sarah stood there, trembling, her grip tight on the key. The house was quiet. But she knew it wasn't over. The key had given her a moment of respite, but the room was still waking up. And it was hungry. And now, it had her name. And it wasn't letting her go. The silence was suffocating. Sarah stood at the center of the room, clutching the key with white-knuckled desperation. Her heart pounded in her chest like a war drum, and her breath came in shallow, quick bursts. She had pushed back the darkness, for now. The shadows had retreated, but the threat was far from over. She could still feel the cold, the weight of the house pressing down on her, suffocating her with its malevolent presence. The air had thickened, growing heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the pressure. It was as if the house itself was holding her in place, watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. She knew it wasn't over. She had bought herself a moment of reprieve, but the house was still hungry. The room still needed her. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry, the metallic taste of fear lingering in her mouth. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting to every corner, every crevice, as if she expected the walls to close in on her at any moment. The shadows were still there, lurking at the edges of her vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. The key that had offered her a brief moment of safety, was now warm in her hand, its surface pulsing with an energy she couldn't comprehend. It was no ordinary key. It was a catalyst. She could feel it. It was pulling her in, urging her to do something, to take action, to break the curse that had bound her to this place. But what? She had no answers. The book, the symbols, the whispers, none of it made sense. All she knew was that the house had chosen her. And now, it was time to face whatever that meant. The air around her shifted once again. The temperature dropped, and a low, guttural hum filled the room. The shadows were stirring, slowly at first, but then more urgently, as if they were gathering strength. The walls seemed to ripple, their surfaces bending and twisting, warping into grotesque shapes, as though the room itself was alive. It's happening again. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let the house claim her. She couldn't become like them, like the shadows, the twisted versions of people that had once been part of the house, who had been consumed by its darkness. Her eyes fell on the broken symbol in the book, the one she had seen earlier. The jagged circle, the line that ran through it, the dark shapes surrounding it. It was a map. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a map of this house, of the curse that bound it, of the evil that had taken root in its foundation. The key. The key was the final piece. She had to use it. She had to place the key at the center of the symbol to break the cycle. But she didn't know how. As if on cue, the shadows lunged forward, their form coalescing into something more tangible. They were here again, faster, more relentless. They screamed, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of terror and rage, each one demanding that she give in, that she surrender to the house. No. Sarah whispered, more to herself than to the darkness. She backed away, her mind spinning with fear and confusion, but she knew one thing, she couldn't stay in this room any longer. She couldn't let herself become part of the house. With trembling hands, she raised the key above her head and rushed toward the center of the room. The shadows tried to intercept her, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down, but she fought them off, kicking and thrashing, her only goal to reach the center where the symbol was etched into the floor. The key, her weapon, her salvation, was all that mattered now. The closer she got to the center, the stronger the shadows became. They hissed, shrieked, trying to drag her into the darkness, but Sarah gritted her teeth and pushed forward, ignoring the overwhelming fear that threatened to drown her. I have to do this. I have to save myself. Finally, she reached the center of the room, the symbol illuminated beneath her feet, glowing faintly, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. She kneeled down, her hand shaking as she lowered the key to the floor. The key hovered just above the symbol, and for a moment, nothing happened. The room was still. And then, with a deafening crack, the room began to shake. The ground trembled beneath her, and the walls groaned in protest as the house seemed to come alive. The shadows screeched in agony, writhing as though they were being torn apart. The key, still hovering above the symbol, began to glow brighter, pulsing with an energy Sarah could feel in every fiber of her being. It's working. But then, the whispers returned. The voices, distant and cold, filled her mind again. This time, they weren't just whispers, they were commands. Demands. You are the key, Sarah. The voice was familiar now, dark and suffocating. You can't escape. You never will. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in from every side. She felt the temperature drop once again, her breath turning to mist in the freezing air. The shadows were everywhere, swirling around her, pressing against her skin. The pressure was unbearable. The key was pulling her in now. It was no longer just a tool, it was part of her. She could feel it. It was a connection, a bond that tied her to the house, to the darkness that had consumed it. It was the final link in the chain that bound her. She screamed, her voice raw, but it was drowned out by the rising crescendo of the house's wrath. The shadows reached for her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, dragging her into the depths of the room. She fought them off, but there was no strength left in her. The house had already claimed her. And then, with one final, deafening roar, the room collapsed. The floor shattered beneath her feet, the ceiling above her crumbled, and everything, fell into darkness. Sarah was falling, weightless, endless, spiraling into the abyss. And then, silence. Sarah's consciousness flickered like a dim light bulb on the verge of burning out. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. She was no longer in the room, no longer in the house. She floated in an endless void, her body untethered, her senses disoriented. There was no light, no sound, no sense of up or down, only the vast emptiness that stretched infinitely in every direction. Am I dead? She thought, her mind sluggish and heavy. The last thing she remembered was the room collapsing, the key glowing, the shadows pulling her under. And now, here she was, nowhere. Her breaths came shallow and quick, though she wasn't sure if she even needed to breathe anymore. Panic began to creep in, curling its icy fingers around her mind. But then, a sound broke through the silence, a faint, rhythmic thump-thump, like a heartbeat. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, stronger, until it surrounded her, echoing through the void. And then came the whispers. They weren't coming from outside her this time. They were inside her head, seeping into her thoughts, merging with them. The voices were familiar now, a chorus of her own fears, doubts, and regrets. They spoke in unison, their tone dripping with malice. You can't run from us, Sarah. You never could. The void began to shift. Shapes formed in the darkness, shadows twisting and writhing, creating something tangible. The blackness melted away, revealing a place that was hauntingly familiar. It was her childhood home. The worn wooden floors, the faded wallpaper, the faint smell of dust and lavender, it was all exactly as she remembered it. But there was something off. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own, watching her. Sarah's heart raced. She hadn't been back here in years, not since her mother's death. This house held memories she had long buried, memories she had no desire to confront. But now, she had no choice. The house wasn't just a place. It was a part of her, and it wasn't letting her go. She took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the house were amplifying it, mocking her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what was to come. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. Light spilled out from the crack, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. It was the door to her mother's room. "Don't go in there," a voice whispered in her mind. It was her own voice, trembling with fear. But she couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved on their own, pulling her toward the door, toward whatever was waiting on the other side. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They weren't just voices now, they were memories. Fragments of conversations, laughter, arguments. Her mother's voice, calling her name. Her father's angry shouts. The sound of her own cries, muffled by the walls. She reached out a trembling hand and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she remembered it, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn, her mother's favorite book resting on the nightstand. But her mother wasn't there. Instead, there was something else. A mirror. It stood in the center of the room, tall and ornate, its surface gleaming like liquid silver. Sarah's reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. Not really. The figure in the mirror was twisted, distorted, its eyes hollow and its smile unnatural. "It's you," the whispers said. "It's always been you." Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding. The mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. And then, the figure stepped out. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. The thing, her double, smiled at her, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as it advanced toward her, its hollow eyes locked on hers. "You can't escape me," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "I am you." Sarah's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But the thing in front of her was all too real. She backed away, her hands searching for anything she could use to defend herself. But there was nothing. The mirror behind the figure began to pulse, its surface glowing faintly. Sarah's eyes flicked to it, and in that moment, she realized what she had to do. The mirror was the source. It was the connection, the gateway between her and the darkness that had consumed the house, and her. If she could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, she could end this nightmare. But the figure was faster. It lunged at her, its hands clawing for her throat. Sarah dodged, barely avoiding its grasp, and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick from the nightstand. She swung it with all her strength, hitting the figure square in the chest. It stumbled back, but it didn't stop. It smiled, its twisted grin widening as it advanced again. Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned and ran toward the mirror. The whispers screamed in her mind, a cacophony of rage and fear, but she didn't stop. She raised the candlestick above her head and brought it down on the mirror with all her might. The glass shattered, shards flying in every direction. The room shook violently, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream, its body convulsing as the mirror exploded into light. And then, everything went silent. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was back in the house. The real house. The shadows were gone, the air was still, and the oppressive weight that had suffocated her was lifted. She was free. Or so she thought. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of herself in a small, cracked mirror on the wall. Her reflection smiled. But she didn't.